people. It may be a plate with a bunch of things that don't go together, but it's one meal.
I can sense that.
Welcome back to Reason Together, the podcast for Christians who think about stuff. I'm Thomas, here as always with my good friend Daniel.
Good morning.
Good morning. How are you this morning?
I'm doing well. Doing well. Yes, thank you.
Good.
Yeah, looking forward to jumping into it again. I just
Yeah, we've got a lot of things this morning. If we kind of got to them all, it would be sort of a popcorn type episode. So we'll have to see how this goes.
And it'd be about 7.5 hours long.
Yeah, that's true. But before we bore you for the next 7.5 hours, before we do anything else, we want to thank our patrons this morning over at patreon.com/reasontogether. Those are the people who have decided to voluntarily and generously donate of their funds to help support this podcast, and their dollars go towards supporting our technical editor and blog editor and our actual audio editor, and paying for our domain hosting and all the other things that help keep the lights on at Reason Together. So we do appreciate all of you as patrons. We do have some new patrons to announce, by the way.
We do.
Which is a thing that we do. When we get new patrons, we give them an announcement here on an episode. And we've got 3
yes,
this morning to announce. Our latest 2 elite patrons are Josh and Michael.
Welcome on board, and thank you very much, guys.
Yes, and a third patron that we have, I think at the premium level, I can't remember which level, is my mother-in-law, Mary. So she is now on board as a patron of this podcast.
Mary, thank you as well.
All of you. Now, Josh and Michael, like I said, they joined at the elite level, so they get the after show bonus episode.
Right.
If you would be interested in listening to that, you can become a patron too. Patreon.com/reasontogether. Join at the elite level, and you'll get the after show bonus episodes.
Yeah, and you've mentioned before that it's kind of more laid back, and yet at the same time, it's not like we're just sort of like just talking about silly, ridiculous stuff in the after show. While we might sort of seem laid back, yet we're still having a conversation. And so there's more content to be had there. And that's neat to consider.
There's something different about it. Mm-hmm. I can't put my finger on it. And maybe it's just because we know we're speaking to an audience that's less than the general public. We're speaking to a small elite group of people. And it just feels more homey in a sense. So in that sense, it's different, but it's also kind of the same, but more.
So all that, yeah. And patrons, thank you very much.
It's exactly the same, but different.
Right. It's like where we're alone together. Anyway, and so if you have any thoughts about questions you've had, maybe feedback about other episodes that we've had, or just something that comes to your mind, you think, how do we balance that? Or what is the connection there? Or does God care about this particular area of life? Feel free to send us that, and we'd be glad to consider it and bounce it around.
Sure.
And reason together through it. It's not like we promise all the answers, but we try to provide a model of what's it like to talk with a friend where you're inputting back and forth and not, giving the wide-eyed, jaw-dropped, you're a heretic look at your friend. It's to truly consider these things. And our email address, reasontogetherpodcast@gmail.com. So if you have a thought, it sounds long, right at first, reasontogetherpodcast@gmail.com. But you do it the first time, your computer memorizes it, and the next time you have a thought, you start going RE, boop, and there's the address, and boom, you're off and running, and you can interact with us.
Yeah, and we have received feedback from quite a few people about this podcast that they find themselves answering the podcast with us while they're listening to it in real time.
That's great.
Because and they've said, I don't have anyone that I do that with, that I can just bounce things back and forth without the fear of being called a heretic or loony. So I find myself answering the podcast and sometimes almost just shouting out things as I'm listening, and that's one of the things people, I guess, like about this sort of odd genre of two dudes talking
Yeah.
about stuff. So, yeah, if you'd like to join the conversation, that's reasontogetherpodcast@gmail.com. All right, enough of that. Let's get into something here.
Yes. Well, one of our recent steps we've been able to take is to hire a blog editor, and that has been a relief to us that we can start getting back to the thing that we really enjoy doing here, and that is talking and writing. It's communicating, and without having to deal with the technicals of it. And that being said, our editor's doing a good job, and we had invited a number of men to write for us. So it's not just us writing the articles. And I wanted to have other men, and even seasoned men, men who have more age and experience. And that doesn't always translate into wisdom. We trust with ours that it does. But anyway, so I just wanted to remind you about the blog post or blog, and just reference a few articles that we've had here since a little bit before Christmas time. We had a post by Floyd Yoder on victimhood, and boy, that's really something in our generation, isn't it? Victimhood, the whole concept of am I a victim and things like that. So you can kind of peruse that one. Then after the new year, we had one. No risk it, no biscuit. And I saw on my Facebook page, there was one, I don't know if there was a couple, 3 responses, but there was one response that was kind of unique. And it was one of those where emojis don't communicate enough. Like, so you're left going, well, what does that mean? Because it wasn't a thumbs up, and it wasn't, well, I don't know what else you'd have. Like, it wasn't like a cussing purple unicorn or something like that. It was
like a surprised face.
Right. It was like this wide-eyed, like, what?
Yeah.
And then you're like,
assuming they clicked the right one.
Yeah, that could be it. Like, they meant to say, hey, nice article. And they're like, what? And then we're left going, what? Well, what did they think? Well, what was the what part? But anyway, so it didn't really leave conversation. It left an emoji, but okay, that's fine. And of course, that was taken from a famous coach of Tampa Bay Buccaneers saying, no risk it, no biscuit, something like that. And but he gets to talking about faith, and you can read the content for it yourself. But he teases the question in the article that I think is a good question: is faith a risk? Now,
are you asking me?
Yeah,
or
I'm
kind
of throwing that out to you. What do you think? I mean, because he kind of goes on and basically treats it as a risk from and he makes the distinction from a human standpoint, yes, from God's, no, I guess. But let's tease that out a little bit more.
Okay. Well, I'm just going to start talking and see what comes out, and see what happens. I would have to, at first blush, think that faith can involve risk. Doesn't necessarily always involve risk, but I think it can, because when I think about what risk is, it's the absence of certainty, right?
Okay, good. Good, yeah.
And faith, doing something by faith, whatever it might be, if you're going forward and doing this thing by faith, there is a point at which you don't know how it's going to turn out, but you know the Lord wants you to do it. So, and we obviously know that there are times the Lord leads a Christian to do something where the outcome is seemingly bad, right? Where it's like, I get injured or my life falls apart and all these sorts of terrible things happen, but yet there's something in the sovereign plan of God that works that out in the end. So, when we look at the possibility that, yes, I can do something for the Lord and seemingly tragic things could still happen according to his plan, but I go forward anyway. Yeah, I'd say there is an element of risk involved in faith, because if it was certainty, then I don't think it is faith anymore.
Yeah, well, yes. And I think, what was it? I can't put my finger right on the passage, but was it Paul that dealt with that either in Romans or Galatians or something? Basically, if it's faith, I guess maybe he was talking faith and works, but it's a similar deal where if it's certainty, then, but I would make this distinction that certain things are at risk, certain things are not. Because if we properly understand
Mm-hmm.
faith, which many people do not, I'm sure, because faith is this very
Right.
arbitrary, nebulous thing. Or even in the Christian realm, faith is, believing what you can't see. Well, that's not a great definition. Faith at its core is basically, uh, I the way I've learned it, is causing firmness to something, which may sound kind of foreign, kind of strange, but basically it's recognizing it's telling yourself, yes, that thing is firm. Okay. That thing is trustworthy and reliable. So
Mm-hmm.
when we have faith in God, we're saying God is reliable. And so that thus we rest on him, we walk in him, we obey him,
Mm-hmm.
we give everything to him because he is reliable. Now, so that to me isn't the risk. It's not like, oh, I hope God's reliable. No, faith is he is reliable.
Right. Well, I
But
mean, I can't help but think of Hebrews 11, right? I mean, what do we do with that where it says that faith, the second half of the verse there, I think it's verse 1, it might be, of Hebrews 11, that
faith
faith
is
is the
the
evidence
of
of
things
things
not
not
seen.
seen. So like a lot of people will look at that and say, see, faith is just blind, but yet the word evidence is used there. There is evidence of something that is not seen. And that's kind of how people move through life, is evidence of
Yes.
things not seen.
But
So it's hard to think of faith as always involving an element of, knowing everything with certainty.
well, right. And I think about we call the three Hebrew boys. They weren't really boys; they were men. Three young
Mm-hmm.
men, maybe, but men, and the fiery furnace. You remember that interaction. Our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us, and He will deliver us, or something like that. But if not, we
Right.
will not bow down. So what was the risk there? What was uncertain was what the outcome of this was going to be. What was not uncertain was what we ought to do and who God is. Um,
Right.
it's absolutely
Sure.
rock solid that there is a God. He's absolutely preeminent, and we ought to obey him. What's uncertain
Yeah.
is exactly how this thing's going to play out. And
Yeah.
so that, like you were
Well, it's the
saying,
idea that whatever he does permit to happen here is going to be right.
yes, the right and the
There's no
best.
uncertainty about that.
Right. There you go. And so that's the part of the faith that says, I know God well enough to know that the things I don't know or understand, I can leave with him. So there is a risk element and a non-risk element to faith. So that was, you can read that post for yourself. And then
Sure.
Pastor Largent had written an article for us. In fact, this is second of maybe what's going to be 3 parts, because he's dealing with an interesting and a sensitive issue, and you can't encapsulate it in 800 words. Obviously, a major consideration like that, and I appreciate, as I've read through, I've realized, oh, okay, that's a neat way to say that. Or he'll come at it from different angles. It's not just, okay, here's party line, this is what I read out of a systematic
Mm-hmm.
theology book. Here's a man who's thought
Yeah.
through the issue, and specifically we're talking about how is it that, I guess we would say it's kind of the sovereignty free will discussion to some degree. I guess he maybe frames it with different wording and things like that. But
Mm-hmm.
touching on how does the Bible say this, and yet the Bible says that, and how does the Bible say this, and the Bible says that, and we like that. I mean, we like to say, okay, well, what about this verse over here and this verse over here? And I don't know that we'll get to it today, but there was one of our supporters wrote in and said, and gave us a response to one of our other episodes and said, okay, here you got this verse and you got this verse, and they look like they're saying the opposite thing, on this issue that we had talked about.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's good to be able to take the verses and then to weigh them in your mind. So anyway, you can read, that's called Asking the Fundamental Question. If you look into last year, you'll find the first part, and then this is the second part. The one part that stood out to me that I wanted to mention was a comment on Ephesians 2:8, and this is probably a somewhat commonly held belief, if you will, or a statement that's not infrequent necessarily. But it says Ephesians 2:8 states that even our faith is his gift. And I personally would clarify that actually is not what the verse is saying. That, Ephesians 2:8, when it says, "For by grace are ye saved through faith, and that not of yourselves, it is a gift of God." It is not saying either that the grace or the faith is the gift. I believe it's speaking as a whole. The salvation itself is a gift, and that's borne out in the Greek by looking at the tenses of things and the grammar of it, which is just like English grammar, indicates certain things and requires agreement of certain words. So you can see it in that as well. That's a point I want to make but anyway,
sure.
We appreciate.
I have a question. So, so you're saying that it is possible using the Greek grammar to tie the antecedent of "it is the gift" to the word "saved" in that verse? Like it's solid. Like you can tie it to that word "saved."
That's
so
not
salvation is the gift.
My argument more is actually that you cannot tie it to grace or faith.
Right.
So, for by grace, because see, in the verse, the "are ye saved" is a verb. So, an antecedent isn't going to be a verb. You know what I mean? A noun to a pronoun is how that works. But so the nouns that you have are for grace are ye saved through faith, and it is the gift of God. Well, what is the it? That's the question. Well, are ye saved is a verb, so in theory, it doesn't connect directly to that word as a grammatical thing, but as but ruling out that it's grace and faith because they're different gender of a word. It's not saying grace is the gift or faith is the gift, but then you say, well, what is it? Well, what's that verse talking about? Well, it's talking about that salvation by grace through faith.
So we can't tie the antecedent to saved or to grace or to faith.
Correct.
Okay. So it's impossible to tie that to any word in the immediate context.
Correct. As far as my understanding of that goes. Yep. So then obviously you have to take.
So me being a guy who's not like great at Greek grammar, is there a solid answer then to say, well, what is the gift that verse is talking about?
Well, to me it is, because what's it talking about? Obviously at some point you have to be able to logically just say, well, okay, what is being expressed here? In fact,
he could be talking about grace. He could be talking about faith, or he could be talking about the whole package of salvation.
Right, which since grace and faith are eliminated as opportunities, then you're left with the third.
What do you mean eliminated as opportunities?
When you say, well, it doesn't refer back to grace and it doesn't refer back to faith because of the disagreement, if you will, in the grammar. The disagreement of the, what is it?
Genders.
The genders. Then you're left with the third option. And I don't know what other option you'd have,
Okay.
I'm going to do a real quick look while we're studying just to double check what I'm saying here to give you more.
Sure.
A couple more specifics.
And I'm not trying to be difficult. I'm not disagreeing with you.
I'm glad you're asking.
I just with thinking through it, I'd like to be able to know if we can tie that phrase "it is the gift" to any particular antecedent. And from what I understand of it, it doesn't appear that we can tie it to a particular antecedent there. And I guess the disagreement comes, and I don't think there's any slam dunk argument here on either side of the issue, because it is a debated subject. I don't think there's a slam dunk argument on either side, personally.
I do more so.
Thinking about the issue, well, I mean, from the standpoint of a guy who's not like trained classically in learning Greek, and I listen to the arguments from both sides, I don't find either side to be super definitive. Just listen, if I was the guy that people were to try to convince, to try and use grammar and say, well, this ties to this. Well, I mean, as it's being explained to me, it doesn't sound convincing on either side. But again, I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm simply saying I think it's more complicated than people make it out to be. It's not just like, boom, the grammar says this, done, argument over. I don't think it's quite like that. You know what I'm saying?
I do. My question would be like, why don't you think it's like that? I mean, maybe it's not like
Well,
that in
because
every situation, but then I have to ask, well, why? If how
because
if
you
God
had said
means what
saved
He
as a
says,
verb,
right?
right? You had said saved as a verb, right? So we can't necessarily tie it as the gift to
Actually,
the verb.
right. It's
Isn't that
participle,
what you
but it's a
said?
verbal. Yes.
Okay, all right. But then we also can't tie it to grace or faith because of the mismatched genders.
Correct.
So I mean, my rudimentary way of looking at that is saying, well, it's not really easy to tie it to either particular word,
Right.
Grace, faith, or saved. That's all I'm saying. To me, it's not like a slam dunk on one side or the other. Because I mean, on one hand, you have the argument of those saying, well, faith is the gift. God, in a sense, makes people have faith who didn't want to. And I don't think that's true, right?
Right.
God doesn't force faith on someone who doesn't want to have it, right? And I don't want to speak for Largent because I don't know the man's entire mind, but from what I've read of his, it doesn't seem that he's saying that either, that he forces faith on people who don't want it. He's welcome to clarify that if he wishes, but I doubt he's
not saying that. Yeah.
Yeah. But at the same time, on the other side of it is those who would say, well, salvation is the gift. And that's classically how we've looked at that. And I have no problem accepting that because I think that's supportable, right? Right? That's supportable by Scripture. That salvation is a gift, right? It's not something you earn; it's given. But yet, then someone would come back if they're playing devil's advocate and say, "Well, isn't faith part of the whole package of salvation?" And then there's a whole nother debate that opens, right? So all I'm saying is, it's not a slam dunk. I don't think. It doesn't feel like one to me. And I know slam dunks. I like slam dunks. This one doesn't feel like it.
And I kind of see what you're saying, although to me it's pretty well like, well, what's my other option,
Right.
And it's not that you have and not that you're trying to twist it like, if you see it this way and maybe take this word to mean, it's just kind of like, well, grammatically those two things don't match, and that is what has to happen typically. That's the way the language works. And so obviously God meant something. What did He mean by that? And so I think, when I'm not saying that He's claiming that God forces faith on people, but if you're just looking at the English statement, I can see why somebody would think that, could say,
sure,
it is the gift of God. Well, the faith, that's the gift of God. But then what does that mean? He commands me to do something only that He gives me the ability to do, and He doesn't, and so, but He doesn't apparently seem to give that ability to everybody, and yet He commands everybody to do that, so it's like, wait,
right.
So then even logically, but I mean, I'm just saying textually, we have to have confidence that we do have the words of God in the order that He gave them. You know what I mean? And there's a grammar, there's a structure to it. And so, but I think by slam dunk, you just mean there's not an absolute connection where I can say, oh, this word ting ting goes, and it just, this equals this. Yes.
Yeah. And that's why debate over this verse continues today because of the grammar. Because one side can make it say what they want it to say, and the other side can make it say what they want it to say, and that's like Pastor Dietrich always says. When a guy says, "Oh, it's clear, it's just clear, it's this." Well, if it's clear, why is there still debate on the issue? That's all I'm saying. But I'm not arguing against what you're saying. I don't believe God forces faith on people who do not want it. I think there's more to this particular verse than what we could really cover here.
All right. Well,
we probably already bored a bunch of people. For both of you still listening.
Yeah. Anyway, you can read that article yourself and read all of his other thoughts. I just highlighting that one there. But keep an eye on the blog. And there's another article coming out. Well, actually, honestly, we're shooting for now for about one a week, aren't we? And
yeah.
one coming out soon that I think will be of significant interest to you. So keep your eye out for that. A fundamental misconception is what I'm looking at soon here. By the time this podcast is out, it might match about the time that post comes out.
Yeah, it might.
So,
what do we want to move on to here?
Yes. Okay. Let me get over to my list here.
I've got one.
Oh yeah, you had. So we were talking before the episode.
It's not on the list yet.
Okay. Yes. Oh, that's right. So here's what Tom does. I put him on and I say, "Don't peek," and that, of course, that's like drives him crazy. Like, oh, I can't look at what the details are. Well, Tom like takes it one step further. He just either one springs it on you and like, oh yeah, I didn't add it to the list, or I say that because that's what he's doing today. And or here's this one. He puts it on without a label at all. I'm like, oh, wonder what that one is, and I tap into it, and there's no details. So it's like, yeah, sure, go ahead and look. And then you look and he's like, I didn't leave you any details. So you can't prepare. We'll get to that one later.
Well, it's usually more like my brain is like, ooh, this would be a good idea. But I'm like busy doing something. So I quickly jot it down on the list and run on with my day and never add any description.
And then I look at the list and I'm like, what?
Well, it's going to be unfortunately, that's often what happens when I look at the list later. I look at it, I'm like, what was I thinking when I wrote that?
I don't know.
Anyway,
okay,
so this one, I've got to ask this. This is not on the list, but it's about the notion of psychosis.
Okay.
So like there's been a lot of talk lately about something known as mass formation psychosis. Have you heard about this?
Negative.
Okay. I'm no expert on this, so I'm not even going to try to elucidate on all the things that cause mass formation psychosis.
Yeah. Okay.
But
let me back up just a second. Like for a minute ago, you're like,
right.
For a guy that doesn't understand Greek, grammar. Now I'm going to switch seats with you and go, okay, number one, you're going to have to define psychosis and then talk to me about mass formation psychosis. So I know what we're talking about here.
Well, psychosis is kind of the idea of an acute or chronic mental state that is marked by a loss of contact with reality. Let's just say it that way.
Okay. I mean, in layman's terms,
delusional.
Somebody those are crazy, but
or I would prefer the word delusional because it seems to be prone to delusions. And by a delusion, it means you're seeing something other than reality and you believe it's real.
Yes. Okay.
Right.
So now this mass formation psychosis.
Mass formation psychosis. This has become a hot button issue that the big tech giants are fighting to suppress. In fact, there was a man who went on Joe Rogan's podcast talking about mass formation psychosis. He was immediately discredited by the scientific community. In fact, it was soon after that, I was listening to the Matt Walsh show, and he said that soon after that episode, you could go to Google and search for mass formation psychosis, and you would get 0 results.
Which, when do you ever
Google,
get 0?
Right?
Yeah, right.
Yeah, and it would say 0 results. And it said below it like a note, like, please hang on while we try to find credible information on this topic.
Wow.
So Google was actively doing damage control to cover up the conversation about mass formation psychosis. But it's kind of the idea of an entire swath of a population that suddenly becomes subject to a disconnection from reality about a particular thing or a set of things. And this guy on Joe Rogan's podcast explained different things that cause mass formation psychosis in a society. He talked about things like one issue that the public begins to hone in on. He talked about leaders who step in and claim to be the savior for that issue. He talked about isolating people from each other, changing their normals to a different way of living. And what you eventually end up with is people with a complete disconnect from reality on that issue or series of issues.
Which sounds kind of familiar as you're describing it.
Yeah.
Sure.
He gave examples of it from history, for instance, Nazi Germany, and so on. But this guy was immediately just plunged into the abyss of, the big tech giants trying to cover all of this up. But it dawned on me more last Sunday. So we had one of those rare Sundays where almost everybody that is associated with our church in one or another was there.
Yeah.
Right. And I don't know if I'm overreacting to this or not, but we still have probably a third or half of the people that were there that wear masks.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That don't need to. Okay. So like by this point, they're vaccinated, there's therapeutics available. The Omicron variant, now the predominant variant, is just a cold, basically. It's super mild. It's not really killing anybody. And there's just no reason for people to be afraid of this at all.
Mm-hmm.
At all. In fact, that was the case a long time ago, and it's even more apparent now. To the point where even people in the left-wing news media are starting to now say the things that people like us have been saying all along. Very early on in the pandemic, like almost at the beginning, I wrote an article about masks, and basically I hardly wrote it. It was just providing people with links to expert resources on masks, all of them saying masks don't work for viruses. That the masks do nothing. So I've been kind of against this whole mask thing from the very beginning.
Mm-hmm.
And it just kind of grieves my heart to go to church and see a bunch of people wearing these masks when it's even more clear than ever they don't need to, and they do nothing. It's nothing more than a face decoration at this point, and yet they're still doing it. And am I overreacting at this point for my heart to be grieved about the spiritual condition of someone who is living in paranoia and under a psychosis of sorts? Now I'm not gonna fault anybody for wearing a mask if they've got like actual physical conditions where they should, right? Where they believe they should. Okay. I mean, I'm still under the opinion that they'll still be fine with Omicron and all of this.
Right. Well,
for the most part.
Because my thought is, if it doesn't actually work, then even if they have a physical condition and it doesn't stop a virus, then it really still isn't helping them, right? I mean, there is no condition where they really actually need a mask.
Right. Very few conditions, I would think. But I'm talking about people who they're young, they're not all like super healthy, but at the same time, it's still not killing that many people right now. The infection fatality rate of this thing is so low right now. It's comparable to the flu. And it's like people never used to treat the flu like this.
Right. Sure.
And it's like at this point, the number one risk factor is obesity. And yet the people that I saw on Sunday that are coming are not doing anything to address that issue.
Right.
But yet they'll wear the masks. And it's like, it's frustrating to me because am I overreacting to think of this as a spiritual problem? That we're seeing Christians who are responding to something with almost unending fanatical paranoia about an issue that really they should not be scared of at all at this point. Now, I want to be sensitive here, because are there still people who are getting very, very sick and even dying of this virus? Yes.
Sure.
Yes, there are.
Yes. Yeah.
And I'm not trying to undermine the grief of those people or the struggle of those people, but it's a very small minority right now. The vast majority of Christians don't need to really be afraid of this.
Well,
so I guess I'm just kind of frustrated all that half the church shows up wearing masks, and in my heart, I just want to say something. Right.
And I can understand that. Yes. I don't think it's totally an overreaction to be grieved by that. I don't know that I wouldn't tie it directly to a spiritual cause in every situation. I would just say, you don't get your information from the right place, or you need to stop listening to so-and-so because they listen to a certain source and then they're like, oh, wow, man, this is really a problem. And this is a problem. And obviously it's who they listen to. So it's not, but if you're addressing the fear issue, even if it, I don't know, even if it was the right source and it was an issue to fear and dread it and to do this, well, that could be a spiritual issue too. So, I mean, I think there is kind of two things at play, but to be grieved with it, I relate with you.
I guess what makes it seem like a spiritual issue to me is that even if they are getting their information from left-wing news sources, even the left-wing news sources now are coming out saying things that the masks are just kind of stupid at this point. Not all of the left-wing sources, but a
Really?
lot of them now are kind of on board with this idea that we should get back to normal now.
Really?
And yet we still have Christians. Yeah.
Hmm.
I've seen several articles this week of people on CNN, even Bill Maher, that vile, quote unquote comedian, is coming out against the whole COVID restriction thing. It's happening, and the CDC and even Fauci have all in the last month or two come around to agree with things that conservatives have been saying for a long time now.
Which is a little concerning. There must be something else at play.
Well, they're like, oh, well, new information has come out, and now we know that the masks really aren't effective. And, they'll say things like that. The CDC director called cloth masks face decorations after 2 years of saying, if you don't wear one of those, you're killing your grandmother.
The new
and there's no new information that's come out about it. There's no new information. They're tired of it now too. So they're trying to come around now to say what conservatives have been saying without admitting that conservatives have been saying it all along.
It'd be fair to say they're saving face.
Yeah, perhaps. But I guess to see even news media on the left is starting to cool on this issue of COVID restrictions. To see Christians who might be getting their information from there still insisting on quarantining for 2 weeks because someone at their job got it and they had an outbreak at their job. So now you're going to stay home from church for 2 weeks.
Yeah.
You didn't get it. You were just exposed to someone who had it. You have no symptoms, but yet you're going to quarantine for 2 weeks.
Right. You could get it and be over it in 2 weeks, possibly. You know what I'm saying? I mean, just many people for that same time. Well, I'm going to quarantine for 2 weeks, then I'll go back to work, maybe be exposed again, come home and quarantine for whatever.
Yep.
Okay. So that makes me think is when you're saying it's a spiritual issue that am I understanding you to basically say the spiritual issue is that they're not thinking? They're just okay. So if they're not thinking people, and that means in a certain analytical way, they take information and they can actually reason through it and go, no, wait a minute, what would be on the flip side of that? What would be your recommendation to develop thinking people? Not just news. I mean, wouldn't it kind of go across the board that if you develop people to think, it's going to affect every area of their life?
I mean, that would be like me asking you, I want you to sum up the entire theological system of the Bible in like one answer.
I might give you 2 minutes. Tick, tick, tick.
Right. No, it's kind of like when you are in a friendly debate with an atheist or a humanist or something like that. There's so much precursory information that they have never even considered. That to start making arguments, it's almost like you have to back them up to like first grade and start making this argument and this argument and this argument before you can even get to the main point that you're looking to argue. So when you're saying, how do you develop a thinking Christian people, right? Well, it's like you almost have to go way back to the beginning.
Yes, right? And start building at the foundation. Yes.
It's the foundations of discipleship, just the simple things of the Christian life. And ultimately, I don't think it's an intellectual issue. Are there facts I can teach them from the Bible that will help them with this? Perhaps maybe a few, but ultimately, I think Proverbs 28:5 has to be kind of the guiding principle. Let me pull that up real quick. Because what you're talking about is not an unthinking Christian necessarily. Well, I guess I shouldn't say that. You are kind of talking about an unthinking Christian, someone who's living in paranoia and fear of this COVID thing at this point. But I was thinking of Proverbs 28:5. It says, evil men understand not judgment. Okay, so that's talking about discernment. So like someone who is morally evil, their discernment is bad. That's what that verse is saying. Evil men understand not judgment or discernment. So there's a direct connection between an immoral person and their ability to discern. And I think that's what we've seen with Dr. Fauci and Rochelle Walensky and Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, all these other people pushing these COVID restrictions, they're not thinking. They don't have good discernment. They don't know how to apply statistics properly, despite the fact that the data is right in front of their face. They understand not judgment. But then the second half of that verse says, but they that seek the Lord understand all things.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what that's not saying, it's not saying that those that seek the Lord become experts in all things.
Mm-mm.
It's not saying that. That's impossible. You can't become an expert in everything. I'm not an epidemiologist, right? But I can have discernment in all things to be able to hear and parse the information and data that I receive and know what is right and know what is not. So I think when you're having Christians who are still living in paranoia of this, I'm not talking about those who are taking sensible precautions.
Right.
I'm talking about just the outrageous paranoia and fear of this at this point when there's so many therapeutics available now that, that they're trying to be hush about in the media. They don't want you to know there's therapeutics. When there's so many options available to make this thing better, and it's much milder than original. For Christians to be paranoid about this right now, it's not an intellectual issue. It's that they are not God-seeking people. They're not. They don't seem to understand the fear of the Lord. They don't seem to be seeking after the knowledge of God personally, because they seem to have no discernment in this matter.
And it goes both ways. I think that for many, they don't have discernment because of a series of choices in which they didn't want discernment. And now they've, in essence, lost an ability to have discernment, and that loss of discernment and moral evil just are sort of a spiral. They're sort of a loop.
Yeah.
But it's not that they can't have good judgment or that they never had the opportunity to have good judgment. Like, well, can't blame them for being evil because they don't have good judgment. No, they didn't want the good judgment. So yes, trying to spark an interest in them. And the verse I thought of as you were talking was Proverbs 4:7. Wisdom is the principal thing. Therefore, get wisdom, and with all thy getting, get understanding. So say, okay, here's a foundational thing. In life, you need to be seeking knowledge and understanding God's design. And that applies to every aspect of life. That you can't, other people just can't be feeding you all the time. You have to be analyzing what's he saying, consider the source. What's the source of authority there? Where's that coming from? Does that make sense? Does that correlate to the other things that I learned? How does that compare with scripture? You got to be analyzing these things.
So what is a pastor to do? What is a church member even to do in a day where you go to church and half the people are subject to mass formation psychosis, and they're paranoid and they're not seeking the Lord. They're instead afraid of something they don't have to be afraid of. When you're a pastor and you deal with, if you even mention the issue of separateness in music or separateness in apparel, I mean, you're going to lose people. That's just a fact. You're going to lose people because you've touched on a subject that is highly personal to them. And if they don't agree with it, they feel like you're attacking their person. Well, it's like the issue with masks is like that times 1,000. I'm serious. I mean, you could talk about music and clothing, nowadays, all you want. You might lose somebody, but I'm telling you, if you talk about masks and you got someone who's wearing a mask all the time, they're gone. I mean, they're gone out the door immediately because they feel like you have attacked their intellect now. And in a sense, you have attacked their discernment.
Well,
you've attacked their spirituality by saying they shouldn't be doing that. So what's a pastor to do? Do you let this go on?
Well, I think one comment on the flip side of what you're saying is they'll not only, maybe feel attacked, but they will see you as the way we see them. He's crazy. He doesn't understand all the knowledge out there. He doesn't understand what everybody's saying. And he's just this guy that's just, out there doing whatever he wants. And he doesn't realize that, we've got a major issue going on here. We got to wear masks. You're crazy.
Yeah.
When we're like, no,
I think you're stupid.
Actually, so what's a pastor to do? Well, I would say a couple, at a really rudimentary level here, I guess, again, foundational. is your pastoring, okay, a large part of pastoring, we step back here. Pastoring is essentially, at least the role of pastor is a combination of three words or concepts in Scripture. Overseeing, example, if you will, the elder, and the idea of feeding and leading. That's the idea of pastoring, feeding and leading. So I think we need to kind of consider, is our preaching feeding? And I know we've developed into a whole cultural understanding of what good preaching is, but we got to be careful that it's and even when we say, well, I know it's not a performance, yet there may still be in our mind sort of a structure that the way we see preaching is, I've got to do this, and when I get done, they're like, man, pastor's a good preacher, like he's a speaker, he really knows how to grab your attention and move. But you have to step back then and say, but did he really take the word of God, break it down so that I can digest it and understand it and learn it? So if we focus on the fact that we need to feed our people, if it's taking a passage of Scripture and then we begin to question their assumptions, and it's not like it has to be this big flamboyant grand thing. It's by this, I say simple, and that's not quite the word I'm looking for, but this breaking down of Scripture and then applying it to their thought process and questioning some of their assumptions. We all enter into life with a set of assumptions, or into every situation with the things we've learned and thought that we knew, and now we confront it with the Word of God, which causes them to go, I believed that for a long time, and that's not right.
If they do that.
What's that?
If they do that, if they at all question their assumptions, which they don't typically, at least not many people do. I think it's a rare person that will listen to preaching that deals with the heart issue and actually question their own assumptions. I think that's rare. I think what more oftentimes happens is that people will not get it until you put a fine point on it. And I say this as someone who has literally in the last 2 years preached on Proverbs 28:5. On this matter of seeking the Lord and understanding all things. I have preached on the matter of faith over fear. I've preached on the matter of wisdom and discernment. I've preached on the matter of not trusting experts that are immoral people because they don't understand judgment. I mean, these are issues I've talked about, and it's like people still don't get it until I put a fine point on it. But if I put a fine point on it, that's the moment where they're like, oh, forget this pastor, he's crazy. So it's like, what I'm asking is, how fine a point do you put on it? Do you want to get up in front of people and say, okay, folks, be done with the masks, let's move on?
Yeah, I would. No, I personally wouldn't. I would be one that's more reticent, I guess, at least at the outset, to make applications too pointed. We have to ask ourselves what we have to give people time to grow. We have to ask, what is the Holy Spirit's responsibility here? And I could think of situations where, let's say we're talking music. And here's like not necessarily a wise thing to do all the time, which preachers maybe have done in the past. You kids listening to this group and this group and this group, they're wicked. Don't listen to them. Well, in 2 years, you got to name different groups, because if that's what you labeled was the group, you still didn't teach them to think per se. You labeled something for them. He says that's bad. Even if they obey, okay, I'll get rid of that. But why was it bad? So again, teaching them the why. And so in a medical perspective, I'd say we could throw it out there to say, there's so many areas of life, but even consider all the information that we know about, health and disease and what's going on in our country. Do we really know what we think we know? Do we need to be doing this? Do we, and so you're sort of bringing it to the table without saying, look, people, if you wear masks, you just need to get over it and blah, blah, blah. Because it's just like we would look back on our own lives and say, yeah, boy, growth took a long time. Or there was a certain time when all of a sudden I realized, wait a minute, or I grew in that step, and something that I had heard, I don't know how many times, finally clicked. And then I made that step. Well, you have to afford them that growth too, and not get them all on the same page right now. Just have to point the ship in the right direction. Get them to at least thinking, and you're sort of pushing on it. You're questioning it. You're getting to challenge, but also there's multiple issues at play. And yes, while the face masks can be grieving or it's irritating, there may be dehumanizing. Yeah. But there really may be more important spiritual issues at play, and that will come into the mix eventually. So, I know it's
I mean, I guess it just seems to me at this point, we're 2 years in to 15 days to slow the spread now.
Yeah.
And
it's the
even
longest 2 weeks of my life.
Right. Yeah. I mean, even left-wing people are coming out now against COVID restrictions. It's happening all around the country. There was just a major thing in DC. Thousands of people marched against mandates and COVID restrictions and stuff. So, I mean, even people on the left are starting to get on board with being done with this stuff. It almost seems kind of ridiculous at this point, after preaching and hinting at the subject of discernment about this for 2 years. It's like, are people ever going to get it? And it's like, at a certain point, you almost have to put the fine point on it. It's like, how long do you wait?
You may
until
feel
you
like
put the
it,
fine point
and
on
yet you have to ask the question that when you say how long until they get it, if you put the fine point on it, you're assuming they'll get it. And in the process, you may just lose them and they still don't get it. So I can't say that putting that, like, if they just if I just said it clearly, they would get it. No, not necessarily, because you're arguing against a whole set of thoughts in their mind that have to be undermined. So, I mean, I can understand wanting to say something and just coming out.
So you think we need to just tolerate this in perpetuity?
No, I mean, if by tolerate you mean let them grow, yes. But if by tolerate you mean don't teach and try to again question assumptions and get them to develop thought and discernment, then no. I mean, not tolerate it in that way. Just keep. It's not. In other words, the issue is not per se off limits, but taking that as an issue, just like any other issue. Here's what I want you to wear. Here's what I want you to listen to. Here's how often I want you to be here every week. And here's how I want you to cut your hair. And here's how I want you to give money. And here's what I want. We don't draw a fine point on all of that. And yet we want them to grow. We want them to choose right entertainment. We want them to reflect Christ in their attitude and in their apparel and in their entertainment choices and in all that stuff like that. We want them to develop a thinking in that. And yet that is a slow process. In fact, my senior pastor, of course, your sending pastor, has talked about, and I feel like we have a unique church here. I love our church, but it's probably not typical to what a lot of people, or a lot of pastors would want or think that they should see. But you have a little bit more independence in the thinking. And so things may not always look like you think they should look if everybody were in lockstep and everybody just, listened to the pastor and did it. But the point is, you're getting the ship pointed in the right direction. And he says, you may not get it to port, but you're pointing it in the right direction. And you may not get it to port, so to say. You may not get all the sheep where you want them, even in your entire ministry, but you've headed them in the right direction. And it's not, if they never make that right decision, if you will, if there's a right and wrong, which I think there is, but say they never make the right, wise choice about masks. Are you a failure? No. Does it mean they didn't grow? No. It just, it's that issue. We'd like to see it change it, but it doesn't mean that we're tolerating it. It just means that we're still trying to feed them in every way possible that we can as a pastor, and challenge their thinking with just being careful to say, where am I overstepping my bounds as a pastor? Now, as a friend, you might have the opportunity, if they're one of those, if you feel like you got a connection with them and they're open and you get into the discussion, we sat down in our living room, and one of our deacons and his wives, we got to talking about masks. Well, I told my perspective, and they kind of, said what they thought, or what, and so in an individual conversation like that, you might be able to say, what's really bothered me is that so many people seem to wear it without thinking because this and this and this and this. Now, you're not necessarily labeling them. You're just saying, it's really bothered me to see that in so many people. And I just wish they'd understand that there's this information out there and that they need to be analyzing what they're seeing. And even nowadays, this and this, and you're maybe getting them to think, oh, really? I didn't know that. That's interesting. It may not take place from the pulpit, but the feeding ministry doesn't just take place from the pulpit.
Sure.
It takes place by a bedside in a hospital, or in the living room as you visit them in their home or whatever. Anyway,
I guess I just kind of view this issue as a very forward-facing issue, not of separateness, but like we talked about, psychosis. And it's a disconnect from reality. And that's why I don't think it's the same as, preaching on, clothing or music or whatever like that. This seems to me a growth stunting issue. Like, I think someone who has different standards of music or apparel, they could grow in other ways as a Christian before they get to those issues. But I feel like someone whose mind is not discerning and they're separated from reality at this point, I feel like that's just a growth stunter. And I feel like until they deal with that issue of their relationship with reality, I don't think they're going to grow in many other ways. To me, at least from my anecdotal experience dealing with the people that I deal with here, I feel like it's a growth stunting issue.
That's interesting.
I'd be curious to hear if other pastors have had a similar observation, that it just seems like people will not grow additionally in any other way until they get over that issue, until they start seeing things in accordance with reality.
Well, and there, may be ways to say, to make an appeal, and again, sort of touch the issue without like just busting it head on, but just to say, I've been concerned as a pastor in the last couple of years that people seem to let issues like, say, masks or quarantine, our thoughts about COVID come between our relationship, and to realize that I'm your pastor. I look out for you. I'm aware of these things. And furthermore, I'm in the medical field. I read and I know these things. And yet I feel that this could, stymie people's growth. This could separate even a pastor-sheep relationship. And that burdens me to say something like that. You're not saying, now, if you wear a mask, you're the problem. No, but to say,
no,
you're addressing the issue, that there is an issue here.
Well, I feel like it would be true of any issue where there's a disconnect from reality. Like, even if it wasn't masks, if it was something else where someone is seeing a completely different reality, I think that's going to be a growth stunting issue, no matter what it is. And I'm not saying that everyone that wears a mask is subject to this psychosis, this mass formation psychosis. I think some are and some are not. Some are wearing it intentionally with thought, and they're really, thinking through some things, and they wear it in a specific set of circumstances. Others just wear it as a token. It's a talisman. It's a security blanket for some people. And to me, it's those people that are divorced from reality. And I think until they get in line with reality, they're not going to grow spiritually anymore. That's my personal feeling on it.
That's interesting. I know we need to draw it to a close because this is a longer episode that we've had going on here. But to ask a question, would you say then that there are some people who might be wearing masks who actually are putting thought into it? Maybe not the thought you wish they were, or they're not getting the information you thought they were getting. And it's not just because they have some serious comorbidities and they really feel like it'll help them. But it's not just like, well, they said put it on, I'm going to put it on. Well, Walmart won't let me go in there without putting it on. But they've actually put some thought that, well, I think this would be, maybe they're coming to a wrong conclusion, but I think this would be respectful, or I think this probably is safe. And so at least they're thinking, and in that vein, they can at least step forward and eventually maybe come to a better conclusion.
Yeah, well, I think there are thinking people who are wearing masks, and I think in that case, it's not psychosis that's the issue. It's not paranoia that's the issue. It's just that they don't know how to interpret statistical data.
Okay, so there is a distinction there, and that's important because the way we've been talking to it up to this point maybe sounds different, but that's good to say there are thinking people who wear the masks. They just, again, don't know how to interpret, or they have the wrong data.
Yeah, applied statistics should probably be required learning for every high school student.
But that's important to note there, that distinction of what we're talking about.
Yeah.
It's just more, you're talking about just a people who are just doing it because the massive pressure without really analyzing much of anything except,
Yeah.
oh, they said it's dangerous. And okay. Without thought.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, hey, if you've got a
Yeah.
thought on this and you want to vent to us and tell us how we are spreading infection and killing our, oh no, just kidding. And
We'll get suppressed by social media for
yeah,
misinformation and
right.
all. Yeah.
So anyway, if you have some thoughts on this, again, or any other question that's coming to mind, obviously COVID has sort of reigned in the last 2 years, but there's 1,000 other issues in your life, and you're just thinking, what about this? What about that? And if you want to bounce it off us and let us, reason through it together on air, if you will, then reasontogetherpodcast@gmail.com. Reasontogetherpodcast@gmail.com.
Well, thank you once again for being with us on this episode. We are encouraging balance, developing perspective, and connecting faith to practice. This is Reason Together.